Hi everyone, my name is Jan and I work as a computer vision engineer at BirdBuddy, and today I'd like to tell you something more about the amazing technology that we use at BirdBuddy that helps us not only detect but also identify every bird and assign it to its corresponding species. The main phrase of this presentation will definitely be neural networks, artificial neural networks to be more precise. And throughout this presentation I will first tell you something more about how neural networks came about. In a very basic sense also how they work, what is required for you to train a neural network, why you would use a neural network to solve particular problems, what are the benefits and what are some drawbacks of this technology. So the term neural networks comes from biological, medical studies and neuroscience to be more precise, so study of the brain. And of course neuroscience is out of the scope of this presentation. But there are still some very important, very basic, rudimental facts which are again very simplified, and these facts have been translated into more mathematical language that computers can understand and have been therefore used. It made it possible for them to be used in neural networks. And these very basic principles are that our brain, or any brain for that matter, consists of a building component called a neuron, which is a type of cell. These neurons are connected with each other using synapses and are able to communicate with each other via electrical impulses. And this entire network of neurons has an amazing capability called neuroplasticity, which is, again, in a basic sense, responsible for our existence, because it is ability of this network to adapt to input and output impulses, in a sense that whichever impulse our biological neural network receives, it provides a particular output, and with a feedback loop which tells us how the actual output differs from the desired one, this neuroplasticity adapts our network, our biological neural network, or any biological neural network for that matter, so in any animal as well, to make sure that the desired outputs will be as close as the actual outputs will be as close as possible to desired ones. These basic principles that have been translated in mathematical sense are these have been translated into more mathematical sense by replacing this neuron cell, a type of cell, with a node that is in mathematical graph theory encapsulates a particular function, a fixed function, and these nodes are connected with each other using connections which have weights assigned to them. These connections replace synapses, and during this feedback loop that I've mentioned before, which is called backpropagation, when it comes to artificial neural networks, these weights get changed. They get either larger or smaller to simulate this neuroplasticity characteristic of the entire network. And by now, I'm pretty sure I've probably confused you even more, but if you bear with me, the following example will be an example that I really believe each and every one of you can relate to, and will clarify these this concept more in depth. And for the purposes of this presentation, let's take an ideal world where there's only you and your child and two types of animals, dogs and cats, and you as a parent or as a teacher are dealt with the task of teaching your child, let's call it a simplified but not simple task of identifying whether there's a dog or a cat in an image. And let's ask ourselves, again for the purposes of this presentation, not to tell you how you should teach your children, but for the purposes of this presentation, let's ask ourselves, how would we achieve that? Well, we take our child for a walk, we would see a dog, we would point at a dog and say, look, woof, right? And our child would repeat, woof, and we would say, correct, that's a woof. You would see a cat, you would point at a cat, and you'd say, look, meow, and your child would repeat, meow, and you would say, correct, that's a meow. And you would do this for many, many samples on many, many walks. And let's say by the end of month 3, your child would start making predictions on its own. And you would go for a walk, it would see a dog, you would point at the dog and say, woof, and you would say, correct, that's a woof. It would see a cat and say, woof, and you would say, no, that's a meow. And so on and so forth. And without you even knowing probably, what you're doing is not only providing labeled data to your child, in a sense that you as a teacher know what type of animal is an image. When there's a dog in an image, the expected output from your child's biological neural network is woof, and when there's a cat in an image, the expected output is meow. But you as a teacher also provide this feedback loop. So you are the one that identifies the actual output from your child's biological neural network, and you provide the information of how the actual output differs from the desired one. And because of this neuroplasticity capability of your child's biological neural network, the synapses, the connections between neurons either strengthen or weaken. In reality, also some additional neurons might be added to a new network. But in a sense, these connections get either strengthened or weakened. And by providing a lot of examples to your child, hopefully in some time, it will be able to significantly increase the accuracy of its prediction. And at a particular age, you will be satisfied with this accuracy, and it will be able to do predictions on its own when it is, in quotes, released into the wild, right? So once this neuroplasticity effect starts changing the connections between neurons, you are actually not interested in which particular connections either strengthened or weakened. What you are interested in is that a particular metric, in our particular case that would be accuracy, either increases or decreases, right? And from that information, you know whether the training process is going well or not so well, right? But of course, there is knowledge in neuroscience which particular part of the brain is responsible for which particular task, for speech, for vision, for hearing, for memory, for motion, and so on. And there is ability to see the before and after picture to identify that there has been a particular change, but not to the degree of particular neuron. And to be completely honest, you're not even interested, at least as far as parents are concerned, right? So in a very, very similar fashion, and again, this was a very simplified model of training a human being, the same training process happens when training an artificial neural network. This neural network works in a similar sense as a black box, which you might have heard before. Of course, you know the architecture, you've designed it, you predetermine the architecture of neural networks. So, for example, you design it so that the initial stage of a neural network, once a particular input, in our example, image, is passed into it, works as a feature extraction. So it determines, it extracts unique features, for example, from an image of a dog. And the final part of neural network is designed so that it makes a final prediction based on these extracted features to which class the input image corresponds. And as you can see on the slide, for example, for the input image, which clearly includes a dog, neural network would provide an output saying that it is 88% sure that there is a dog in an image and 12% sure that it is a cat. And with a feedback loop that I've already mentioned called back propagation, you provide information needed to correct, to adapt weights in this artificial neural network to hopefully on the next image make a better prediction, right? So the question that might pop up to at least some of you at this point is, well, why would you use this method? Why not simply predetermine conditions, predetermine rules based on which a computer should make a decision whether there's a cat or a dog in an image? Well, the answer is very simple. The answer is that even though if this might appear very simple for us as humans, this is practically speaking impossible, right? Why is that? Well, this is probably because feature extraction and generalization is extremely important for us as humans. Extremely important for us as humans in a sense that it was vital, it was rudimental for our survival. So if you can imagine that if you were going through woods, it is really important for you to identify that there is a tiger hiding in a bush by simply seeing, for example, its snout, right? Because by the time you see the entirety of the bird, it's unfortunately probably too late for you, right? But this is not the case when it comes to artificial neural networks. So they work in a sense as tabula rasa. So before you introduce it to any data, to any training process, they know nothing. And even when you introduce them to a particular data set, let's call it training data set, they are only aware of this data. They have seen no other images. So, for example, as you can see in this, this image, I'm pretty sure that most of you will be able to tell me that on the left image, I'm not sure which one you see as left, but the one with the eye is an image of a dog, and the one containing a snout is an image of a cat. And not only that, you'd be able to make this decision in split second. But then, if I asked you, why did you make this decision? You would see that this concept of black box really starts to pop out, in a sense that, well, of course, you could start reverse engineering. Why have you made this decision? Because there is this shape of snout that makes it a cat and so on. But if I moved my camera slightly to another part of the cat, you'd be able to tell me, you'd with very high probability still be able to tell me that this is in fact a cat in an image. So those rules that you've described me before for this particular image would no longer apply, right? So what is the solution? What is the solution? So why is this principle that we use when training artificial neural networks different from predetermined rules? Well, we just simply, and again, very simplified way, just make sure that we show our neural network as much data as possible. Not only that, as much relevant data as possible. So if our task is, for example, to classify between images of cats and dogs, we also have to make sure that our training data really resembles the data once the model is trained and deployed into production as much as possible. In this particular case, I guess you imagine there is a big difference between a Chihuahua and a Saint Bernard dog. So there's a difference in size, in shape, in color of the fur, in shape of the ears, in length of the snout, and so on. And it goes exactly the same for cats. So you have to make sure that your training data is as versatile as so-called inference data. So the data that the model is faced with once deployed into production and faced with data that it has never seen before. Of course, if your goal is for your model to achieve great accuracy, that would also mean that if you used images of dogs and cats when the entire body of dog and cat are seen in those images, it's very likely that your model will not perform as good when at inference stage, so when running in production, it will be faced with images when only parts of cats and dogs will be seen. But again, let's say that we somehow have been able to obtain this type of data. So if I return to my previous example, we have not only used our neighbor's dog, Fluffy, as a training sample for our child, but we've actually gone out for walks and we've made sure that our child encounters many dogs across the entire variety of species, shapes, sizes, and colors. Let's say that we've achieved this goal. And then, so your child is able to, we can assume with a 100% accuracy, able to identify whether there's a cat or a dog in an image, regardless of the image. What would happen if a strange mutation happens in this ideal world, and there's a new type of animal, and let's call it, for the purposes of this presentation, a bird, right? What would happen if we showed an image from our bird body feeder that contains 2 specimens of birds? And not only that, they are of different species. Or what would happen if we show them these 2 images of Oriolas and a hummingbird on our bird bath feeder and hummingbird feeder, both available on our new Kickstarter campaign? So what would happen? What would be the output from either our artificial neural network or biological neural network of our child? Well, there are a few things that we can say. And the first one, the most important one, is that the output will always be either woof or meow, because your child has no other concept. It has no concept of any other animal, any other object whatsoever. It has been only taught for this particular task. Of course, it might be hard for you to imagine this when speaking of actual human child, but this is the fact when it comes to artificial neural networks. Since artificial neural networks have never been introduced to any other class. And of course, even though you're able to correctly identify whether there's a cat or a dog in an image, that doesn't help you much once you're faced with images of any other animals. And how would you solve this problem? Well, you would generalize your task. So your task would now become classification between 3 different classes, 3 different types of animals, or 3 different types of bird species, or for that matter, arbitrary number of species of birds. The difference would be that you would have to provide images from these 3 different classes, so classes of birds, dogs, and cats, with, of course, corresponding output pairs, so woof, meow, and some sort of chipping sound, and use the exact same procedure as you've done with the very basic binary classification, so when there are only 2 output classes. So now, let's say, equipped with this basic, very basic understanding of neural networks, let's look at some concrete issues that we, our machine learning team at BirdBuddy, are faced with, and how we use this technology of neural networks to our advantage. And the first task that we are trying to solve is the problem that arises from the fact that images acquired by BirdBuddy are acquired once triggered by a motion detected on a perch. So what that means is that we don't have an expert photographer that makes sure that the lighting conditions are perfect, that the entirety of the bird's body is seen, so that all the beautiful either colors or shapes of the bird are visible to us. Our camera model does the triggering on its own when it's, like I said, detects motion and captures images with a particular frequency regardless of the, let's say, quality that we could in some way assign to images. And we have internally agreed that, and also with the feedback from our users, that at this stage we would like to filter images that we internally named not interesting. You can also look at them as not likable, not shareable. So images that you would basically not want to keep on your mobile's device memory or share with your family, your friends, your community. And not only that, once you filter out images that, like I said, don't represent a bird in its entirety or are not taken at best lighting conditions, the species identification is much, much easier because, as you can imagine, differentiating between a Californian and Kenyan towhee, which will meet very soon, is really hard based solely on the image of their feet, right? And not only that, our statistics shows that pretty much 80% of the images taken by our feeder, taken automatically, pretty much resemble 100% to the images that you see in upper row. So assure that you have, at least to a particular degree of confidence, an interesting project. You can move on to the next stage, and this stage makes sure or takes into account that our neural networks can also be faced with images that contain multiple specimens of birds, and not only that, these specimens can be of different species. So we have to make sure that we do species identification per detection, so per every specimen. And how do we achieve that? A neural network that resembles the network that the neural network, the artificial neural network that we've seen before, which had image as an input and a sound, which basically is just identification of correct classification as an output. Well, while in this case of detection model, the input is image, but the output is a set of coordinates of this red rectangular shapes called bounding boxes that sort of encapsulate up to rectangular shape accurately where the bird appears in an image. And once we've also achieved this task, so that we are able to detect all of the bird specimens in an image, we can then move to the next stage where we, like I've already mentioned, identify each detection, so classify each detection into which species it corresponds, right? And again, like I've mentioned before, when we introduced a new class of bird, while already knowing two existing classes, dogs and cats, your neural network will always only be able to identify species that it has been introduced to in training stage, right? So, having settled that, you might also ask, okay, we know how neural networks, practically speaking, work. You've already told us that why they are used, because writing predetermined conditions is hard for very simple task, simple in a sense how we as humans treat it. But what are the pros of using this? Well, apart from what I just said, the benefits of using neural networks are pretty much the same as benefits of using computers in general, right? So where they, at least as far as I'm concerned, differ from people, from us, the most is the fact that they don't have bad days, right? They are not affected by lack of sleep, lack of food, lack of drink. They are not affected by having a mortgage or having annoying kids or annoying neighbor. So they are ruthlessly consistent. The neural networks that we're using are also what is called deterministic. So whenever the input is the same, the corresponding output will always be the same. While we can definitely not say the same thing for a person, right? So also with the advancements of graphical processing units, which enable us to parallelize computations required for an input to be, let's say, evaluated once run through a neural network, these computations can be parallelized, and this increases the speed even more, which makes a task of classifying 100,000 images a very simple task for a computer, which takes it a few minutes, while the same task would require an expert few days, right? Also, when it comes to data storage, practically speaking, they are limitless, right? So the amount of data that you can use to train a neural network is practically speaking limitless, right? So the memory aspect of neural networks is limitless compared to human beings. And of course, if you use, like I've already mentioned, a versatile enough data or data that also resembles the inference data as much as possible, the model, because it's consistent, will also be very accurate in that aspect. So the results will not change throughout the day. And of course, because there is no such thing as free lunch, there are also drawbacks with neural networks. And I've pretty much already mentioned all of them, but let's just recap. Let's do a recap. So provided that you have enough computational power and storage power to both train neural network and then also run it in production, the main problem that you'll be faced with when your goal is not only research but deploying a model in production is having a good quality labeled data. What I mean by that is, as you can imagine, if you showed your child 10,000 examples of dogs and only 2 examples of cats, it will be much more successful in extracting unique features that identify dog. but not so successful when it comes to cats. So that's also another aspect. So you have to first have enough data, you have to have balanced data so that all of the classes are as equally represented as possible. Like I've already said, your training data hopefully resembles inference data as much as possible. But once your goal is to classify between several hundreds of classes, in our particular case at BirdBuddy species, is very high likelihood that you'll stumble upon classes that, at least as far as visual data is concerned, are very similar. I've mentioned them before, so these two species, Kenyan and Californian towhee, are two different species, as names imply. But for example, for a non-experienced bird watcher like me, an expert could easily convince me that these are in fact the same species, that the difference in color is just the variety of the color within the same species, or that one image is an example of an adult and the other one is an example of a juvenile bird, or the one is in the breeding stage, breeding period of its life, and the other one's not. The one might be female and the other one is male. So what I'm trying to say is that even though it might appear easy for a human being, training a classification model, i.e. artificial neural network, not i.e. an example of artificial neural network, can become really hard once you start having a lot of output classes. You can have a lot of output classes once each class represents a completely different object. For example, it's much easier to differentiate between a general class of a car and general class of a dog, while differentiating between a general class of dog and general class of wolf becomes much harder, or general class of Kenyan towhee and general class of Californian towhee, because in a sense they both represent the same more general class of bird, right? So the differences between birds become much smaller, so you really have to make sure that the data that represents this class in a training stage really covers the entirety of unique features that differ this class from other ones. So luckily, the data that is available to us at the time that images are acquired is also timestamp and geolocation, well, to 30 miles accurate. But when it comes to bird habitat ranges, 30 miles is practically nothing. So the areas which birds inhabit, and we can use this information to our benefit, so that if we are able to determine that on the image is either Kenyan or Californian towhee, that's good enough of information for us, and we can use geolocation to then determine which particular species between these two really is in an image. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So at this point, I would just like to thank each and every single one of you that are members of our community. You might not even be knowing this, but every single image that you share is used to not only improve all of the principles that I've mentioned before, so especially classification aspects, so classifying which bird appeared on your feeder, because this data can and is and will be even more shared with research community, which empowers them to predict those are migration patterns, which Dejan already talked about in his previous lecture, and therefore maybe predict any changes or reduces in the number of particular species and helps them save the environment. So I really hope that this presentation inspired at least one of you, so that as the motto at BirdBuddy is to motivate you to interact with nature some more, I hopefully achieved the goal that next time, instead of reading about celebrity gossip, you might consider reading something more about this amazing technology, generally called machine learning or artificial intelligence. We've only touched a very small portion of it, artificial neural networks, and hopefully someday make a change to this world like we are at BirdBuddy. So thank you. And, oh, right. There's also a Q&A section right now, so please post any questions and I will try to answer them. So the question is, why birds can be on the feeder and no postcards are received? Well, that's actually a question that's not related to artificial neural networks. It might be in some cases, so that images have been identified as not interesting, but in most cases because the camera model has either not been triggered or the sensor has been in some other way either obstructed and has not done its job. So another question is, does the BirdBuddy learn over time that more common birds are more interesting and therefore rare birds are accidentally ignored? Or is there something in place to prevent this? Well, neural networks are trained so that there is no difference between species. We are well aware that less common species, so rarer species, are of course less likely to appear on our feeders, but they will get identified as the entire image will get identified as either interesting or not interesting regardless of the species. We are, however, working towards a feature that will also be achieved using neural networks, so that each image will be identified as interesting to a particular degree, so that we'll be able to, let's say, filter out the images of more common species that might not be as interesting to our users anymore, but make sure that even though image might be classified as not so interesting with a low degree, but would represent a much rarer species, this will still be passed on to our users via the app. I hope this answers your question. Okay, so the next question is, what is the minimum amount of images you need in order to identify a bird? Well, that's a $1 million question. The only answer I can provide to you is the more the merrier, right? Like I've mentioned many times throughout this presentation, your neural network has to obtain as general sense of what particular species in our case is, and that can only be achieved by providing as many samples as possible to it, right? But by taking also into account that the data, so the number of images between classes has to remain pretty much balanced as possible, Yeah, we're talking about several thousands of images. We've been able to achieve a quite good accuracy with several thousands of images. Okay, so the next question, does lighting or background affect the AI? Well, the answer is it depends. So, well, the answer is also, what do you mean by affect? But I think I understand what your question is. So, I've mentioned this in the presentation. So, as long as you make sure that your neural network is presented with data that might have, that will have all the possible different backgrounds or lighting conditions, which of course you can't, right? But to as high degree as possible. That's why I also said in the previous answer, the more the merrier, right? As long as you make sure that, let's say, darker background or very light background is in images that are presented to a neural network during the training process, then the identification or the detection and then identification of the species of the bird can be achieved, right? But if you used, for example, high quality images during the training process and then at the inference stage introduce your neural network to very low quality images, then it is expected that the accuracy will drop, right? So, or if you used only background with snow, images that where there is only snow in the background, and then at the inference stage introduce only images that have woods, yes, then the decision that neural network makes can be affected by that. And if we are honest to ourselves, we do that too, right? We do that too, because it's a bit harder for us to understand this concept, because like I already said, we have to have an amazing capability of generalizing. But if you as a child were only introduced to cats and dogs, once you would encounter, for example, a bird, you would be confused, right? Because you have never seen it before. And it goes the same for backgrounds. If your neural network has never seen nothing but snow, when it will see green forests, yes, it is probability that it will get confused. So be affected, the predictions that it will be making will probably be affected by background. But that's why we also use detection models to reduce the amount of area based on which our classification model has to make predictions. So prediction in which species the particular bird belongs to. So I guess that's it, and thank you.